Bread has been a staple in the human diet for thousands of years. But for the last few decades, modern diets have villainized the baked good. And bread has been taking a hit over the years. Total US sales have been stagnant since 2015, showing little to no growth leading up to 2020. And on average, Americans spent less money on bread in 2017 than they did just 4 years earlier. Not to mention the fact that some of the country's biggest bread manufacturers are complaining about the rising costs of key ingredients. In an industry where small players battle low margins and excess capacity, the bread business has to consolidate. Sara Lee and Wonder Bread, two of the biggest names in bread, both were bought out by publicly traded Flour Foods in 2012 and 2013 respectively. And another big problem for bread, it's facing increased scrutiny for some of its extra ingredients. Things like chemical dough conditioners, preservatives, added sugar, and GMOs. Those additives help manufacturers produce a loaf in less time, prolong its shelf life, and keep the bread soft. But bread is making a comeback. Well, specifically this, preservative-free, artisan, tangy-flavored sourdough bread. Sourdough is made with just 2 ingredients, whereas a loaf of Wonder Bread has over 20 ingredients. Another big difference, sourdough can take up to 7 days to make from scratch versus just a few hours to make commercial bread. There's also a price difference. From 2015 to 2019, sourdough bread sales have seen significant growth. Sourdough is also growing more popular at restaurants. In 2019, it was on 14.3% of restaurant menus, up from 11.6% 10 years earlier. Even DIYers are getting in on the sourdough craze. Now, spending days baking bread is the cool thing to do. Instagram is full of DIY self-taught bakers making their own sourdough. Even coders out in Silicon Valley are blogging about the fermentation graphs of their sourdough starters. And perhaps most importantly, health evangelists are praising the benefits of adding sourdough bread into your diet. Between sourdough's almost cult-like following on social media and a more health-focused consumer base looking for better food options, sourdough bread is more popular than ever. According to a survey, almost 9 out of 10 people know about sourdough, and another 7 out of 10 have tried it. In the US alone, sourdough is a multi-billion-dollar market. Between 2014 and 2018, sourdough's market value in America jumped from $298.7 million to $2.4 billion. The question now, is the sourdough market destined to keep rising, or is it just another fad destined to fade away? Sourdough is made with just 2 basic ingredients, flour and water. You mix them together, leave it at room temperature over time, and feed the same amount of flour and water for a few days. That mixture, when exposed to the elements, eventually starts to bubble. And that bubbling is actually a chemical change called fermentation. What's happening is that microbes from the surrounding environment are essentially colonizing the dough, then growing and dividing, basically turning it into a medley of flour, water, bacteria, and wild yeast, which is a single-celled fungi. The bubbling mixture is called a sourdough starter, and you could think of it as a living thing. All that bacteria is generating lactic acid, and the yeast is actively feeding off starches and flour. It pumps the resulting carbon dioxide and ethanol into the dough. The carbon dioxide expands the gluten network in the dough, while the acid and alcohol is what gives sourdough its sour taste. It also digests this gluten network and allows the enzymes present in the flour to do their job, like cutting the starches into edible pieces of sugar for the yeast. Though sourdough's origin story has been contested over the years, the first written record of sourdough dates back around 4000 BC in ancient Egypt.
The first written evidence on sourdough is from the pyramids. And there are hieroglyphs showing people making beer and bread in the same hieroglyphs. So there's this crossover of fermentation.
The sourdough starter was discovered when a mixture of flour and water was exposed to the elements over time. The mixture began to bubble and rise, a process we now know is called fermentation. Rather than throw out the odd-smelling and expanding mixture, the mystery cook decided to bake it anyway. The result? A large, round, spongy loaf of bread that we now call sourdough. Since ancient Egypt, this method of bread making was passed down from civilization to civilization, from ancient Rome to ancient Greece, all the way to the American Yukon Gold Rush. Using a sourdough starter was pretty much the only way of making bread for thousands of years. But things started to change for sourdough during the later half of the 19th century.
Now, as the population kind of changed and we went towards cities, we obviously had to feed a population on an industrialized scale. So we had the creation of an industrialized bread system.
It wasn't until the mid-19th century that scientists caught on to the microbiology behind what makes bread rise. Once they knew about wild yeast and how it works, a race set off to figure out how to make it available to the masses. Brothers Charles and Maximilian Fleischmann were one of the first to bring commercial yeast to the market on a large scale when they unveiled their product to 10 million people at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876. The only problem? It was perishable and would go bad after 2 weeks in the fridge. It wasn't until World War II that the bread business was totally revolutionized.
As the war came in, the American side, they contacted the Fleischmann brothers, who were the people who originally discovered that you could turn yeast into a tablet. And in the 1940s, the push was to produce fast bread for soldiers.
The Fleischmann Company improved on its original yeast product by creating the first ever active dry yeast. It didn't require refrigeration and could be easily activated with warm water. Fleischmann's active dry yeast was a game changer to the commercial bread business as well. After the war ended, active dry yeast was brought to the retail market, and the mass production of bread in the US took off, which was bad news for the slow-baked sourdough bread. Out went the use of sourdough starters, and in came what we see today. Large commercial bakeries filling grocery stores with ready-made pre-sliced bread wrapped in cellophane that could last for weeks. By 1944, 85% of the bread that was made in the United States came from large commercial bakeries, according to a survey conducted at that time. From the 1950s up through today, bread companies have continued to add extra ingredients to its products in order to make bread faster than ever and to prolong its shelf life. But the same chemical additives that helped industrialize bread quickly and cheaply brought on a laundry list of health concerns for shoppers.
Well, we're not post-World War II anymore. We're in a very, very different situation. And so this very fast plastic kind of bread, which was really, I guess, done out of a well-meaning sort of aim, is actually causing issues across the globe with people's health, wellness, blood sugar management, calorific management, and the amount of nutrients that they get from their base food.
2000 was the year of peak grain, when the average American ate 137.6 pounds of grain in a year, mostly in the form of breads and other baked goods. According to the USDA, per capita consumption of flour was 146 pounds per person in 2000. In 2018, it had fallen to 132 pounds. The timing dovetails with the rise of low-fat and low-carb diets in the 90s and early 2000s. This decline has also come as more and more Americans are diagnosed with an allergy to gluten. Remember gluten? It's the protein that plays a key role in helping dough to rise. The number of Americans following a gluten-free diet tripled from 2013 to 2018, according to Sundale Research, and gluten-free products appear to be virtually everywhere. Nearly 30% of consumers are now buying foods with gluten-free labels. And sales of gluten-free foods reached $17 billion in 2018, more than double the amount spent in 2011. All this may seem like a doomsday scenario for sourdough bread, but sourdough has actually proven to be one option for bread lovers who want to eat the real thing without facing nearly as many side effects as its commercial bread rivals. So why is that? Sourdough is typically more nutritious than regular bread, it's easier to digest, and it is a potential better option for blood sugar control. The reason? It all comes down to the active dry yeast versus a sourdough starter. What makes a sourdough starter so special are all the microorganisms derived from the fermentation process. Commercial bread misses out on that. It uses an active dry yeast which simulates the chemical process that makes bread rise. However, it lacks the naturally occurring fungi and bacteria that sourdough bread has. Here's why that matters. Sourdough's slow fermentation process makes it a lot easier for our bodies to absorb important nutrients. All of those microorganisms in sourdough also promote gut and metabolic health. Sourdough also doesn't lead to blood sugar spikes and crashes. It actually slows down the speed at which glucose is released into the bloodstream, which is a great thing for diabetics who have to watch their insulin levels. Sourdough has another big thing going for it. Store-bought bread has been put under intense scrutiny for the extra ingredients manufacturers add in order to extend shelf life. These include everything from extra gluten, fat, reducing agents, emulsifiers, enzymes, and preservatives. Some US commercial breads, along with a lot of other foods found in grocery stores, were slammed for using the same chemical ingredient found in yoga mats.
When I first discovered making sourdough bread, I realized even the best bread I was giving my family wasn't real bread. It had, 38 ingredients in it, and it should just be flour, water, salt, and yeast. And I make a lot of it, and we eat a lot of it, and we're not getting fat from it, and we're not getting sick from it. And my friends that have thought they had gluten issues had no problem with it. And it wasn't that it was gluten, it was that we were eating chemicals and fake processed food.
Sourdough's surge in popularity isn't just linked to health-conscious consumers. It's actually developed a cult-like following on social media and has drawn attention from a new wave of DIY bakers. In 2019, one of the founders of Microsoft's Xbox, Seamus Blackley, resurrected a sourdough starter dating back over 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. Blackley used dormant yeast and bacteria from ancient Egyptian pots. He mixed those samples with the sourdough starter he made, creating this, a sourdough loaf with its origins dating back to ancient Egypt. Blackley isn't alone in his affinity for delving into the science behind sourdough. Silicon Valley coders are charting out the fermentation of their starter cultures to try to understand the inner workings of all of its microbes. Since sourdough starters all contain living microorganisms, it requires constant attention like all living things. If a starter is properly taken care of, it can last for years, decades, and sometimes generations.
None of us has something that is old, and if you have something that's 100 years old, it's almost certainly an heirloom that was given to you. It was a set of earrings that came from your great-grandmother or some vase that came from the old country, but it's not something alive. Imagine having something alive that's 100 years old. So the stories that come with starters, I think, are valuable. I think they're part of a recapturing of culture.
Maintaining your own sourdough starter isn't an easy business. It requires constant feeding to ensure that the same starter can be used over and over again. Feeding a starter looks like this. It's just simply adding a little bit of flour and water to the mixture. And over time, it becomes like taking care of a new family pet.
There's a whole schedule. It's like a pet. It's like, you don't just get a goldfish and then leave town for 3 months. It's like you need to feed this thing. Like this is mine right here. And this is one of 2. And when I take off, I'm a comedian. When I'm on the road, I'm constantly thinking like, who's going to feed it?
That's where a unique sourdough business like Matthias Jacobsen's comes into play. Jacobsen has been baking sourdough for nearly 8 years, and for 5 years, Jacobsen has been operating the Sourdough Inn in Brooklyn. He takes care of people's starters while they're on vacation, feeding them with flour and water a few times a week.
The questions I ask as part of the check-in process, like I want to know how they currently feed it, and just so I understand what they're trying to do with it. So they told me like they would prefer to just feed it, around every 5 days, and generally keep it in the fridge. So this one is very, very low maintenance in terms of what it needs. Generally, the sourdoughs I've had not been any kind of peculiar requests. And then other than that, I think it's like meeting as people that are passionate about something. So I always ask about people, how they started making sourdough and why.
According to his website, Jacobsen charges $15 per week for hotel services and also runs a training and rehabilitation service that revives a starter for about $60 per session. The idea for a sourdough hotel in Brooklyn actually originated from a sourdough hotel that started in Sweden.
There is a sourdough hotel in Stockholm. Scandinavia has a generally advanced bread culture. So in Stockholm, obviously, there was this sourdough hotel, and they were teasing me and saying, well, because you bake bread, Matthias, you need to be the one to start a Brooklyn sourdough hotel. You really need to do that.
In Sweden, some bakers can bring their starters to RC Chocolat. It's a bakery based in Stockholm that charges their guests 100 Swedish krona, or roughly $10 per week for each of their starters, as of February 19th, 2020. And about 1,000 miles southwest of Stockholm, there's another place where sourdough starters are looked after and handled with extreme care, and it's in the world's only sourdough starter library.
The collection last week was 115, but now we have up to 125. So these are the fridges. They are filled, of course, with the different sourdoughs.
This is Carl Dismet. He's the head baker of Parados, and he runs the first and only sourdough starter library.
And then here we have number 43. which was actually my very first sourdough I saw in my life.
Back in 2013, the company Puratos launched its sourdough library in St. Vith, Belgium. The library develops, researches, and preserves the biodiversity of different sourdough starters for the future. And while there are just 125 starters in the library's walls, there are over 1,600 starters registered in the company's digital library from all around the world. Each new starter that arrives to the library is sent to a lab for analysis, a process that can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 to analyze a single starter.
So every sourdough that we get into the library is sent to a university with whom we work together. That can be in Italy, in France, in Spain. And there the sourdough is actually placed on Petri dishes. And then they grow the cultures. And as such, it takes about 3 months, 45 working days on average. You can select the different colonies on these Petri dishes and grow and grow and grow them further. Then we are actually taking all these different microorganisms, and we have these little test tubes where so the isolated strain is put in there, and that can be a yeast or a lactic acid bacteria. And as such, the sourdough strains are preserved for the future.
In the library, there are some starters that date back centuries.
The baker who gave me this said that it must be from 1886, more or less. Then we have this one, which is number 100. That's a sourdough that we have from a bakery in the center of Tokyo. And that was a sourdough that has been developed by Mr. Kimura. And he was one of the last samurai. And he converted himself into a baker. And one of his friends was making sake based on rice. And so he converted his sourdough into rice. And so this is now the only rice sourdough we have in the library, and it dates back to 1875. And then this one is from Ione Christensen in Whitehorse, and she was the first mayor of Whitehorse and the senator of Yukon, and this sourdough dates back to 1896, when her great-grandfather was participating in the Klondike Gold Rush.
So why spend thousands just to analyze starters several decades old? Carl says the research that they're providing actually helps the bakers of today and the future.
Through DNA analysis, they are identified. And as such, we have discovered now more than 950 different strains already from 6 genus of yeast and 6 genus of lactic acid bacteria.
Since its discovery, sourdough has been a key fixture across different cultures and countries around the world.
Bread has been a staple food for the last 5,000 years, and it will probably be the staple food for the next 5,000 years, maybe more, because it is a fantastic product that can be set in the middle of the table and unite all the good things.
Sourdough has survived the invention of commercial active dry yeast, no-carb diets, and some analysts say sourdough has a lot more room for growth. But with the rise of sourdough, so too comes the rise of sourfaux bread. Sourfaux is a term used for retail bread that claims to be traditional sourdough, but in fact, sourfaux has the same commercial yeasts, additives, and flavoring as the cellophane-wrapped retail bread. As imposters flood the market, some worry it would be bad for sourdough street cred as a locally produced, artisanal, premium product offering a healthy alternative to commercial rivals. But sourdough experts like Tom Papa aren't too worried.
The reason why we're the first generation that has all of these issues. We're heavier than ever before. We're being told that you can't eat bread. You're being told that all this stuff makes you sick. It's not the case. The case is that in my lifetime, we've been eating a lot of things that were not food. They were food adjacent. So I really think that processes like this, like making sourdough bread and making real food, is just going to get bigger and stronger.